Good evening. Can I be heard in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. It's not quite as loud as we have it souped up last time. Welcome to the May program for the Ripon Historical Society, our last for this half year, but we have a full program next fall. Before I introduce our program tonight, let me mention again, if you have not seen the scouting exhibit in the other two rooms, be sure to do so. It was a lot of time and effort went into it, but it's also turning out to be one of our most popular exhibits. We've had two scouting groups in, and it was a hit with the second graders when they were here, as well as having retired educators in to see it. So it's been a very popular exhibit. And then if you would go to the other direction, down the stairs, you'll see our newest acquisition, the Baby Charlie tombstone that you may have read about in the paper. Charlie Pedrick, which was Sam Pedrick's little brother, who died at the age of 1.5 old. And through the generosity of Dennis Miller, who found this, we now have it. So you might take a look at that as well. Our program tonight is about two men, Frank Farvour and his father, also Frank Farvour. We have an exhibit dedicated to the elder Farvour over here. Ripon is characterized by a number of things, but one of them is the extraordinary collection of fine homes that we have in this town, dating back, many of them, to the late 19th century. These homes are in fact so fine that one would imagine that a great deal of architectural expertise and engineering expertise went into them. But in fact what went into them was builder expertise of a sort that we don't have any longer. And one of the primary builders in Ripon was Franklin P. Farvour, Frank Farvour's grandpappy. So Frank is here to tell us about Franklin P. Farvour, both the builder, the person who built all those homes that you see with the little violet markings on them, but also a very warm human being who took a great deal of delight and care in with his grandson, our Franklin Farvour. So with that, Frank.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Well, my paternal grandfather, Franklin Pierce Farvour, named after President Franklin Pierce, was born on a farm in the town of Sheboygan Falls, Sheboygan County, on November 23rd, 1863. His father had enlisted in the 1st Wisconsin Infantry at the beginning of the Civil War, and so he was in from the beginning. He was badly wounded at Chickamauga. In fact, as my granddad described it, passing the story that he'd received, he said a bum shell busted behind him and blew off half of his foot. And he crawled into a shell hole and hid. And the Rebs come over and overrun him. And then the next day, the Union forces drove him back, and they took him and got him back to what such medical facilities as were to be had. He was discharged as disabled and went back to his Sheboygan County farm. But then an advertisement came out to the effect that a $300 bonus would be paid to anyone that would enlist in the Union forces. He applied and was accepted, disability and all. But he came through that in fine shape in that, as he described it, he spent the rest of the war guarding Washington, D.C. So he came out of that pretty well. From early on my lifetime, I recall I referred to Granddad as Gramps. And I think that was perhaps by his suggestion. And he was typically, as many good fortunate people are, he was great with kids. The kids gravitated to him, and he to them, and directly all of my friends were calling him Gramps too. Well, I took occasion to that. In fact, he wasn't their grandpa, he was mine. They should refer to him as Mr. Farvour like they did all other adults. But that didn't stick. They all called him Gramps and he loved it. So, that's the background. He told me of the happy days he spent in Sheboygan County. The Sheboygan River wasn't far from their farm and provided swimming and fishing and all the good things that little boys enjoy. 40 acres of probably the best black dirt there was anywhere outdoors. And so what did his dad do? Sell it and went over to the town of Dakota, Washington County, and took up 40 acres of sand. And Gramps told of going out and laying under a big pine tree and crying for 3 days. That was a terrible thing to do. But he was stuck with it. He was educated in a typical one-room country school in both Sheboygan County and in Washington County until he had completed 5th grade. And by that time, it took everything everybody could do to wring a living out of that miserable soil. So he was needed to help work the farm. And that was the end of his formal education. You wonder then, how could a person with that little background of formal education do the things that he did? And I don't know yet. So, anyhow, he worked there, working the family farm with his dad. And of course, his dad's disability asserted itself. And they did all they could. And then they ran out of work to do. They couldn't do any more with it. So he ended up working out as a hired farmhand in other farms nearby. And he told of one occasion where he and his companion farm boy decided to go to town. And they went to Plainfield because it was nearer. And they chanced upon a saloon. They'd never been in one before, they had no knowledge, they weren't saloon-wise at all. But the saloon keeper says, boys, gin and wine makes an awful nice drink. Well, they had one. And as he described it, sure bored a hole going down. It was an awful nice drink. Well, they got sauced to the eyeballs. And luckily, it commenced to rain, and they had to walk several miles home in the rain. It sobered them up. But he asserted that that was his first and last snootful that he ever had. Anyway, that's that part of his education in growing up. He had 2 brothers that I know of. Now, perhaps there were 3. I don't believe there were any sisters. One named Will did migrate to Green Lake County or Winnebago County, where he married and raised a very large family. And I mean very large. And his progeny raised large families. So, if you see the name Farvour anywhere within 200 miles of here, you can't help but be a relative. And fact is, I was coming across southern North Dakota, and I saw a great, enormous tank farm. Oil tanks, these great, humongous ones, you couldn't see the end of them. Farvour Oil Company. Well, golly, at least one of us made it. And I did run it down a little bit, and sure enough, it was a relative. So anyway, how that branch of the family got there, I don't know, but there was plenty of them to diversify. The other brother was named Alfred, and he was killed in a stagecoach runaway between Watoma and Plainfield. He had apparently put the reins over his back when the team took off. He was dragged off the coach, and the team ran. Each horse went one side of a fence post. He was in the middle, and he took the fence post in the chest, and that was the end of him. So our family has had its go-around. So that's the background. back in 1930 or so, we made a pilgrimage over to Sheboygan County. We found the farm. Gramps was still living with us. And he told us that the house and the barn and everything was just exactly as he had seen it last in about 1872. So for nearly 60 years, that place was unchanged. I ran it down a few years ago, and when I got there, there was nothing but a hole in the ground where the house had formerly been, and another hole in the ground where the barn was. But at least I did have a chance to see it. But I wasn't as photo-wise then as I am now. I never took any pictures. So, anyway, like I say, Gramps was denied a lot of formal education, but it's going to turn out that he didn't really need it. The lifestyle that he had on the Town-to-Go farm continued for 5 or 6 years. It approached 1880, and by that time he was relatively grown. He was still a teenager, but he was, as he described it, tougher than a boiled owl. And that's pretty tough. He was courty and wiry. He never had an ounce of fat on him between the day he was born and the day he died. And he had incredible strength for a little feller. Anyway, he got sick and tired of being a sand farm boy, and he went all the way up north to Price County and had a couple of years in the lumber camps. And he thought he was going to be a logger, but he wasn't big enough. So they made him a cookee, which in other words was a cook's helper, a gopher. The guy that did any job around the cook shanty that the cooks didn't want to do. And he did get to go out in the woods on rare occasions, and he proved himself that he could swing a lance just as good as his big companions. But after 2 years of being a permanent KP, he said, nuts, the sand farm isn't any worse than this, so he went back. And this continued then until 1890. How it came about, I don't know, but in some way he became acquainted with Francis Janes, the Janes family of the town of Berlin, and in due time they were married. And about that time he made a radical move. He moved to Ripon. And Grandma was pregnant at the time, and his family was still back in the Wautoma area, but his father was in declining health. And on November 23rd of 1891, Grandpa was between Wautoma and Ripon on a bicycle, and his father was dying in Wautoma, and his wife was giving birth to my dad in Ripon, and he wasn't there for either one. But an interesting thing about how small the world is, that birth took place at 708 Ransom Street in the house that my grandson now owns and occupies. So it's a small world. About that same time, he resolved to be a carpenter. Now, I don't believe he had any previous training or knowledge of the carpentry game, but he went and he signed on as a hourly wage carpenter, beginner, and he worked that way between 1890 and 1900. I don't know who he worked for along the way, but in 1900 he was working on the building of it became the M.E. Methodist Episcopal Church. It's now the community church down at the corner of Ransom and West Fond du Lac Streets. His employer at that time was a man named Radway, who did make a fairly good name for himself as a builder here in town. The man was skilled, and he probably taught my granddad a great deal of what he knew. But the day the job proceeded, and the day came that they needed to cut the pieces and assemble the timbers to support the roof over the main hall of the church. And because that room is nearly square, the plans called for some very complicated assembly of these trusses. And Bradway wasn't there. And they knew if they sat on their butts and did nothing, that would be very bad news. Granddad took he says, I took my steel square and the plans, and I cut the pieces for one of them trusses. And we put them together and they fit. And we put the truss up and it fit. So we went right ahead and built the rest of them and put them up. And then he said, when old Radway got there, he was fit to be tied, because we had gone ahead and taken a chance without him. But then he checked everything over, and when he got through, he was like a kid with a new toy. Everything was just right. Then Grandpa said, "For God, if I can do that for old Radway, I can do it for me." And he quit right there and went into business for himself. What he did for money, I have no idea, but at beginning, trainee carpenters weren't making money enough to want a gun with. But he quit and went into business, and that was in 1900. I don't have any record of buildings that he built right off in 1900 or 1901. But in 1902, it began to blossom. And I think right now, with that, I will start to show you some pictures. I'll need to connect up or get the remote and turn it on. Would you?
I'm gonna watch your lamp on it.
I think I can. Let's see if you can get this lamp hooked up. It would be fine at that, but I don't think the wire's long enough.
That's right.
I don't think it'll reach. You got one back here? Good, thank you. Got it. Good, thank you. Oh, that's fine. Okay, well, the first building you're going to see is the one standing at 932 Woodside Avenue that he built essentially single-handedly. Of course, some of the activities required more than one man can do. So he would bring his crew in when he could spare them to give him a hand on that. And let's see, that's the one right there. The lumber bill, the materials bill, to include wood and metal and glass and the whole shebang for that big house was $800. The house was built and completed in 1902. So now it's 103 years old, and just as straight and sound as the day it was built. I was born there in April of 1919, lived there until I went into the Army in 1941. Dad lived there until his death in 1965, and my mother a year beyond that. You see, at the end of World War I, Tramp's wife, Grandma Frances, had died in late 1918, so I never knew her. But here he was left with that big house all to himself, and so Dad and Mother and almost me moved in very welcomely. And then later in 1920, his sister-in-law, my great aunt, moved in, and as they did in those days, moved in to stay a spell. Well, that spell stayed until her death in early 1940. But anyway, the house was adequate to our needs, but he was ahead of the pack with this building in that he independently had a small pipe extension of the water main laid to his house, because the main, such as it was, ended about 300 feet away. So they had city water. They had an indoor toilet, and nobody else in the block did. They all still used turbies. And also, he had it wired for electricity, so they had electric lights, while everybody else had kerosene. And that was really, it was an outstanding building for that time of the year, that time in time. So now, go backwards or forward. Okay, is that sharp?
No.
See if you can do it there. Now this is another house built in 1902, at the corner of Thorn and Woodside Avenue, built for John Seeley. And I know nothing more about it than that. I believe John built it for his own use, but then later wanted a somewhat bigger one. And so in 1903, he had this one put up. John Seelig and my granddad were very good friends, and he built, as you see, splendid houses. And these are not old pictures. These were taken within the last year. Every one of these houses it apparently instills pride in their occupants and owners, so they take good care of them. They keep them up and they don't abuse them, and those houses are probably going to last for 100 more years without any problem at all. Next, we see this is now over on Watson Street, built for the senior Mrs. Higbee. I don't know, she was the mother of Kenneth Higbee, the later lawyer. And she had it built, and Kenneth and his family lived in it, while their house further up the street was being built. And that house is, this is wrong, out of place. I'll talk about this now. This is the Hazeltine house over at 537 Watson Street, the big house on the east side of the street with the 4 columns in front of it. This is built for Will Hazeltine, and it's a landmark. There's no question about that. There's the Higbee house, the one built for Kenneth himself. I don't know why that thing is eternally out of focus, but it can be corrected. Again, this is a splendid, splendid house. And this was the carriage house for the Higbee mansion. John Eckstein bought it from the Higbee, or from the, well, I guess it was still Higbee owned at the time, and moved it over to Newberry Street, where he owned a line of lots, and he converted it into a duplex. It took very, very little work to do it, because I was in that building when it was the carriage house on the Higbee property, and it was as fine inside as it was out. It was just a magnificent, polished up structure. Just a delightful and beautiful thing. So, next. Now we come up to 750 Ransom Street, a building at the corner of Howard and Ransom, now owned by Dr. Jim Williams. This was built for Strauss, also in 1907. It's a magnificent building. Shortly after Strauss finished with it, it was bought by John Haas, the local brewery operator, who became very, very wealthy. And he died in the flu epidemic of 1919, and his wife, Ida, took over the place, and she depended on my granddad to patch it. As any tiny, tiny thing took place that needed repair, she hollered for him to come and take care of it. It was just automatic. And he was happy to do so, because he was proud of his work. No question about that, and so he enjoyed doing it. Next we have, this is the house built for A.B. Carter, actually built for Colonel Carter, who had been a colonel in the Civil War and always retained his designation of rank. He was kind of a huff and puff guy. Anyway, the colonel had this built for his son Arthur, and it was a nice piece of work. The house was originally stucco instead of this vinyl siding that's on it now. But then Granddad told of their having the house nearly complete when the colonel came around to have a look at how things were going. And he was very happy with what he saw till he got to the kitchen. And then he looked and there was no kitchen chimney. Then he started to bellow and roar and make a hell of a fuss because there was no kitchen chimney, and he acted like Granddad was to blame for it. Granddad pointed out to him that it was not on the plans, it was not in the specifications, and they didn't build it for that reason. They weren't told to build it. Well, the Colonel continued to rant and rave and carry on, and as Granddad told me, he said, it's a good thing I didn't have my hammer in my hand, because I probably would have plunked him with it. And what he did was then to build a kitchen chimney, modify the timber work and the whole shebang, just to keep the peace. And he did this at his own expense. This is one of the things, a good example of why he never became a rich man. Okay, and beyond that, now go to a house built for Saxon in 1915 at 524 Woodside Avenue. This was later occupied by Dana Billings and his family. They took occasion to remodel the kitchen, and they had to tear out the old cabinet work. Granddad was not one to refuse to use glue in building a house, especially in cabinet work. And when they tried to tear out the cabinet work, the wood broke before the glue joint would let go. That's the kind of work he did. And the house still stands there as straight and firm as ever. It's a fine example of as a good piece of work. Okay, the next one, the house up on 218 Spalding Avenue, built for Eddie Bain. Eddie Bain was a grocery man. He operated the Duval grocery store. And that was a complete contract piece of work. It started out with a contract on paper and a vacant lot. And it was the responsibility of the contractor to do everything. This meant build the building, see to its wiring, see to its plumbing, see to its painting and garnishing and finishing, putting up the window shades, and when done, hand the owner the key so he could move in. And that's the way it was done. That house is still standing as you see it, and it's a fine structure. Now, next. Okay, this is out at the corner of Stanton and Hall Streets. At 561 Hall, actually, built for Charles Kozinski, the barber, in 1916. That, too, is in beautiful shape today. Next, we have the house that was owned and occupied by Stuart Nash, situated at 320 Oak Street. It was built at the order of John Seelig, who paid for it, for his daughter Florence on her impending marriage to Stuart Nash. I may get some flack on this because I've reported this way before. John was not particularly pleased at his daughter marrying Stuart Nash. In fact, the word has come back to me that they weren't quite sold that he had his blessings on this thing. But he still paid Grandpa to build a house, and there it is. And it's still in excellent shape and repair. The next project, sometime prior to World War I, was a building you may remember if you think back to prior to 1960, a two-story brick and concrete building at the same location that the SentryTel office is now. It was then the location and operation of Northwest Telephone Company. That was the only fully masonry building that he ever put up. But I understand when the time came to tear it down, a hell of a time doing it because it was put together to stay. Okay. Here's a weird one. Now, I wish they hadn't painted the building because there were rust stains on it showing where each big bolt was, the building was threatening to fall down. The south wall above Scott Street was bulging out, and they came to him for a solution. Well, what they did was bore holes through the wall and run 1.5-inch steel bars the whole width of the building, and put a big washer and a nut on the end of them, draw them up tight, and tie that building together. Now, this occurred probably in the neighborhood of World War I, and the building is still standing with the wall just as straight as it was built. So that's a bit of an accomplishment too. They, earlier, before they painted, there was a rust stain going down from each one of these bolt heads that you would see. But now, it just, you see the building, and you see it's not falling down.
Now, he just repaired this building?
Pardon?
He repaired the building, he didn't build a building.
He only repaired it.
Repaired it.
Yeah. Okay. Then, this one at 348 Scott Street was built for Shields in 1919 to 1920. I, of all things, have the original contract for the building of that building. The total cost of the structure was about $2,700. You couldn't build a house like that today for $150,000. Things were different then. Okay. Then we have St. Peter's Rectory. He didn't build the building, that was done earlier. But they had a serious fire and the whole top side of it burned away. And it was a very interesting fire, and for some reason, there was a large quantity of World War I rifle ammunition up there. And as the fire burned, of course, the ammunition was popping off like a bunch of firecrackers, and the firemen were scared stiff. Well, actually, they had no reason to be, because Granddad brought quite a bit of the stuff home, some that had been fired and some that had not. And actually, I had cartridges with the side blown out, but the bullets still in place. So really, there was no great danger to the firemen, but I don't think I'd too much care to have been involved in that anyway. But they had the contract to rebuild the whole upper section, and that was really a major piece of work. So, here is the building built for Carl Fossman at 216 Watertown Street. Nothing unusual, except the building was done, and the painters were a subcontractor. This is another one where Granddad had the whole package to produce. The painters had used linseed oil for one purpose or another, and had a rag soaked with the stuff, and they left it in a pile of rubbish in the basement, and it combusted. It caught on fire through spontaneous combustion, and there wasn't any fire damage to the building at all. But there was a good bit of smoke, and of course, the whole house had been freshly painted and decorated and looked beautiful. Well, put in a fire insurance claim, and they got to complete redecorate. And Fossman wasn't totally satisfied yet, but his father, Herman Fossman, he just kind of said out of the side of his mouth, "You better keep quiet, kid, because you got yourself a real good settlement." Anyway, that's what happened there. And then, figure out what we are.
That's Heckman's house.
Heckman's house.
It's on Ransom.
That's the Chittenden, built for Fred Chittenden, one of the operators of the Ripon Lumber Company, built in 1922. It's at 514 Ransom, essentially across the street from our Hedrick Lawson house. I remember the building of that one. It goes back just about to the beginning of my recollections. And then we have the Coal Hardware building. It was Coal Hardware, it was Berlin City back at the time, in 1922. A passerby saw smoke coming out of a store in the early morning, and he turned in the fire alarm, and the firemen came, and the fire department from Berlin came, and they did confine the fire to the upper 2 floors, although the fire jumped over into the grocery store next door, which is now Diedrich Jewelry, and that building was burned out. Granddad, again, was, through his good friendship with John Sig, was automatically hired to rebuild the building. And what you see there is what he produced. Due to the fire damage to the stone wall on the north side of the building, you can just see a bit of it above the 2-story store. It was necessary to tear that wall down and rebuild it. So, in this instance, he had a subcontractor do the work. So they tore the wall down, about 10 feet of it, and that wall was a full 20 inches thick. And from all the way from the front to the back, and they piled all of that rock on the fire-damaged second and third floor. Well, Granddad figured there was at least 100 tons of rock in that pile. On a Sunday afternoon, he was up there wandering around, making his plans for the next day's work, and he no sooner stepped out of the second floor door into the alley when that whole pile of rock went through to the basement. He'd been under that rock time and again in his walking around the store. But he just shrugged his shoulders and says, well, guess the time hadn't come yet. He was very blasé about such things. Anyway, the store was rebuilt, and it is, as you see it there. Then came his big one. And this is the best picture I could get. I went to the church presuming that they would have as-built pictures of the tower and the extension to the west, but they had nothing. This was a picture from a postcard or something like that. As you can see, it was a terrible quality. This is the biggest job he ever had. It was more than he could handle alone, so he went into a limited partnership with Frank Rudolph, and they built the addition to the west, which is the main hall of the church, and the tower. I was up there to see things happen frequently. He often took me to the job to point out what was going on and how they did things. The amazing thing about this job was that there are steel beams, steel trusses going from one side of that hall to the other, which is close to 50 feet. And those had to be massive trusses. They were hauled over from Vulcan Steel in Fond du Lac on the railroad, and luckily the railroad was right next to the church. They were unloaded manually and moved into the church and raised by hand. They had, I went up to see that happen. They had just a simple A-frame of timber. I think they were about 10 by 10s with cross braces and a big winch in the bottom with a crank at either end, and a series of gears so that every turn of the cranks might not raise the thing a ½ inch. But be that as it may, those massive trusses were raised by nothing but 2 men turning a crank, and raised to their proper position and swung into place, and they are there to this day. The pilasters that were built to hold them were adequate, and barring an earthquake, I suspect they're going to be there for a very, very long time yet. So, the end was not yet. This is situated at 375 Tigard Street. It was built for Norman Kiefer in 1926. see, he hadn't lost his expertise by any means. And then the next building was his main effort. This was the building built for Joe Barlow at the corner of Thorne and Watertown Streets, now owned by Jeff Bundy. This is probably the most elegant house of its time, of modern design, just a magnificent piece of property. The brick used for the outside were salvaged from the chimney from the old arcade mill, which had burned in 1920. Somebody took one of those bricks and took a chisel and broke off the existing surface, and every sort of color turned up. You get one brick might be one color and another brick a different one. So Barlow bought the chimney and had it knocked down, moved the brick to the location and had them built into his house. So that was the last house Granddad built, the last contract he entered into. The Depression came by and nobody had any money to build houses or anything else. So he had naught to do but simply back off. And this, of course, gave him time to do things that he liked to do, such as go fishing and gardening and make violins. And he did all these things and enjoyed life considerably. But in the spring of 1940, Charlie Blake, the operator of Blake's Bakery, came to him. Of course, there'd been friendship between Blake and my dad, and our families knew each other for years and years. Blake wanted him to build him a house, and he had no crew. Well, he was out of business for 10 years. But he accepted, he would agree to help Charlie. And so he asked him what he wanted, and Charlie gave him a rough sketch, probably made on a bread wrapper. And he refined it a little bit, handed it to me, and I had just got through with the course in mechanical drawing. I drew the plans, and he then saw to the advertising for bids and the letting of the contract. He supervised the construction, and when the work was done, to his satisfaction, he allowed Charlie to pay the bill. That was the last private contracting that he'd been in. Meanwhile, in 1933, I believe it was, the Ripon Municipal Hospital was built. This was a federal project of PWA, Public Works Administration, luckily financed mostly by the federal government. And he was hired as the architect superintendent for the job. And it was up to him to see to it that the plans with specifications were adhered to the Nat's eyebrow. And this being the case, he had to get a little crusty once in a while. But believe me, the city and the government got their money's worth on that job. I wanted a picture of it for this show, and I can recall seeing postcards of the building as it was originally built. Now it's been added to so many times you can't find the old structure. But that was there, and it was a godsend for him because he'd had no income of any kind for a couple of years by then, maybe 3. And then he got that done, and then came one of the typical make-works jobs. They had him and other men who knew buildings. I think I had 2 or 4 teams of them working in pairs, going around measuring every house and drawing a picture of it, taking all the dimensions, and they had a nice picture of every house in town. And for this, he was paid a wage, probably comparable with what you'd make anywhere else at the time. And that, too, was a blessing. But that was his work. And he didn't, once he got through with that, he left the job market and never came back to it. But then came the time to build violins. In the interim, sometime in the first decade of the 20th century, he was approached by the management of Ripon College to take the job as superintendent of buildings and grounds. I often wonder what would have happened had he done it. But he didn't, and he continued to build houses. He declined because he had some reason to dislike President Hughes, who was president of the college at that time. But again, had he done that, my dad could have got through college in 4 years instead of 7, and the entire picture would have been so very, very different. So, in addition to all these buildings I've shown you, and the show is over.
What year was that house built?
The Bumby House was started in 29, or Philo, started in 29, finished in 30. Let's see, this is a picture of the house built for Charlie Blake. So, that, would that I had more to show you, but I don't. There are other houses around the town that I am sure, but not certain, that he built. Go on the floor. Don't mind that. The house right north of the Heseltine house, people have come to me and asked me, did your granddad build that house? Because the workmanship smacks of his way of doing it. Everything relates. It was built for Roy Reed. The property was given to Roy to build a house on by his father, L.E. Reed, who lived in the big brick house at the corner of Watertown and Watson. L.E. had also given a lot to his daughter, who was married to Will Heseltine, and Granddad built the Heseltine house. And the Farvours and the Reeds were good friends from the beginning of time. The siding on both houses is identical. I feel there's enough circumstantial evidence there to suggest that my granddad probably built that house, but everybody that knows where it may have come from is long gone. So it never will be proven one way or another. Another house is one owned by Otto Luck, up at the corner of, I think, Doty and Tigard. Again, the Luck family and the Farvour family were good friends from years and years. Granddad built a summer home for Luck out at Green Lake. The workmanship smacks of his work. Everything is right. The time period is right. Again, I am virtually sure that Granddad built that house, but again, I can't begin to prove it. He left no records. And this is an odd thing. I know that he kept a checking account, because I've seen him write payroll checks. But he must have kept books of some kind. But after he died, not one shred of paper of any kind that would give a record of his work was to be found. He must have thrown it all into the shop stove and gotten rid of it. Why? I don't know, because it sure would have filled a lot of voids had we known that. But anyway, can't go back and unring the bell. So, he also built many, many buildings out at Green Lake. There were 10 either full-time homes or summer homes on the south side of the lake. 5 of them on the north side. The first big growth of Tuscumbia Country Club, when its clubhouse went from a not much more than a shack to a very nice building, the one that burned after it had been modified several times. He also he built an addition for the peacocks on Sugarloaf. Now there's an interesting tale to be told there. The Granddad instilled in me the philosophy that the last thing a carpenter ever touches is the broom. They made the mess, but let somebody else clean it up. That was below their dignity. Well, Peacock had beaucoup money, and he was the great jeweler from Chicago, and he wanted an addition built onto one of his buildings. Granddad got the contract, they moved from Ripon to the location with a lumber wagon, hayride, so to speak. They put their big tool chests onto it, and they put themselves onto it, and they moved to the job site and moved into one of the outbuildings, a shed of some sort, and lived in it while they built the building. Then it was done, and the time came to pay for it. And the chips and blocks and shavings and sawdust were everywhere. Well, Peacock came by and he said, "Oh no, oh no, you get your money when the place is clean." Well, they had to unbend and go against tradition and clean house. Well, they ended up with 4 barrels. He didn't say barrel, he said barrel. 4 barrels of sawdust and chips. What to do with it now? Well, there was no abandoned rowboat washed ashore alongside of Sugarloaf. And he went and got it and bailed it out and put the 4 barrels of chips and rubbish into the boat. Now, where he got it, I don't know, but he come up with 4 sticks of dynamite and some caps. So he put a capped stick of dynamite into each one of those barrels, set them afire, and pushed the boat off. And the wind took it off into the middle of the lake. Well, then he began to worry. If somebody saw that fire out there, they might go out to see what's going on and get themselves blown up. Well, of course, there were all outboard motors at that time, and not really any great reason to worry about it. And he said, all of a sudden she went off with a bang you could hear from one end of the lake to the other. And the next day, you could never find one shred of the boat or the barrels, but the fishing was pretty good in that spot. That, there are those interesting anecdotes. But to get over then into my relationship as grandson to grandfather, that incident of the dynamite precipitated his educating me about dynamite. And he was very perceptive in that he could imagine, he could foresee what a kid might do if he got into contact with some dynamite, and it wouldn't be pretty. So he saw to it that I was fully informed as to what dynamite looked like, what caps looked like, what fuse looked like, and if I ever got to be where it was, if I ever saw any anywhere, run like hell and get out of there. That's what he put it to me. Well, that come to pay off later. While they were building the Lawsonia golf course, my dad was good friends with a fellow named Fred Meek, who was an electrical engineer working for Lawsonia in all the many projects. We were invited to come out to their place on Lawsonia, right next to the golf course, for a Sunday dinner. And that worked fine. And after dinner, the old folks were talking, and I was turned loose to go out and poke around. Well, I wandered along the way, and here on the stone fence, not more than 20 feet from the house, was a pile of greasy-looking sticks. And a whole bunch of little brass outfits that looked like 22 cartridges without any bullet. And a whole big coil of stuff that looked like clothesline rope. Well, from Gramps' lecture, I knew that this was dynamite, it was caps, and it was fuse. And I was scared stiff. I walked backwards and making sure that I didn't disturb a twig. And once I got far enough away, I run like fury to get back to the house to tell them what I knew, what I saw. I had to stand on one foot and on the other until I was recognized, and Dad said, well, what do you want? Because I was taught not to speak to adults until I was spoken to. Well, I finally got the chance to talk, and I said, there's a pile of dynamite and caps and fuse out here on the fence. And Dad, what the hell does that kid know about dynamite? Well, Meek was different. He said, tell me exactly what you saw. And by the time I got through describing it, he was white as a sheet, because there was dynamite there enough to blow that house to kingdom come. He says, I've heard enough, and he went to the phone, made some calls, and directly a crew came by and first removed the dynamite, and then removed the caps, and then removed the fuse. This was in ignorance to the max, that nobody ever keeps caps or squids, as they're called, and dynamite within yards of each other. And here, a supply of both was immediately adjacent. So, afterward, Dan says, well, how did you know about dynamite? I simply says, Gramps told me. That was the way it went. That's the kind of relationship we had. So, further of our relationship and his violin making. How he ever learned to make violins, I have no idea. How he learned to play the violin, I don't know. But he did relate. And even back before they left Sheboygan County, playing the violin or fiddling in the saloons for pennies. And where he got the violin, I don't know. But from my earliest recollection, he built violins, and he built very, very fine instruments. He had books that he had acquired. He also had purchased, and probably for half a year's pay, a set of books called the Encyclopedia of Architecture and Building. And he read that series of books from one end to the other more than once, and he learned. He also, as I say, had books on violin making, and he apparently was self-taught. But he decided he was going to build a fiddle, and he built a fiddle. And he was an absolute perfectionist. He would not tolerate anything that smacked of almost good enough. That wasn't good enough. That's all there was to it. So he built violins, and after, of course, he, quote, retired, he had occasion to build more of them. He had time to build a lot of them, and he did. I believe he built no less than 50 very, very fine instruments. I know the whereabouts of 2 of them. My granddaughter has one in Syracuse, New York, and my son has one in Waukesha, Wisconsin. The rest of them, who knows where they are. There was a happy boy out there somewhere. One day, the boy and his mother and dad came to the house, total strangers, wanted to see Granddad. They had a violin with them that was coming apart, that had come unglued, and they wondered if Granddad could put it back together for him. Well, he looked at it, and it was something they had bought from Searsville, bought for $13.95. But it was junk. The inside had never felt solid on sandpaper. It was crude, downright crude. And he was fiery. He put that fiddle down on the floor, and his shop was out in the garage at that time, and took a hatchet and smashed it to splinters and threw it in the stove and burned it up. And then he turned around and made that kid a quality violin and didn't charge him a dime for it. He just couldn't tolerate anybody trying to play such damn piece of junk as that. That was his way. He never became a rich man. For the projects he completed, he should have. But he was probably his own worst enemy, in that he was too honest to even come anywhere near the line, to say nothing of stepping over it. If the plans and specifications didn't call for something to be done the way he figured it should, he would do it better at his own expense. Well, you can't make any money doing that. The going rate for carpenters was 60 cents an hour. He paid his men 60 cents an hour, and he did not charge the customer one dime of markup on that labor charge. I don't know if he took any markup on the materials or not. The only money he got out of a job was what he earned by working along with the crew. his conscience was the clearest of anybody in this world. But he sure was he died as poor as a church mouse. So it be. Anyway, he loved to fiddle, he loved to build violins. He built them to micrometer precision. And the inside was as smooth as the outside. Now, a violin back or a violin top is not bent into shape, it's not pressed, it's carved out of a slab of wood. The top is cut from the best spruce that can be found, and the bottom from prairie maple. At least that's what he used. By the time he got through carving, 80% of the wood that was in the slab to start with was in shavings on the floor. And it was, I say, just glossy smooth inside. It was his way of doing things. That's all there was to it. He made many friends through his interest in violins, and among these was a man named Laffy. Edgar Zobel was running the Zobel's studio, Zobel Music Studios, and Edgar taught the brass instruments. Lillian taught piano and organ. A man named Bronson taught the woodwinds, and Mr. Laffy taught stringed instruments. No sooner had Laffy come to town that he and Granddad got together and became very, very good friends. Laffy was a splendid violin player himself. I remember one evening, I can visualize this as if I was there now. The evening meal was supper, not dinner. It was held at 6 o'clock every night. We were all there. We ate together as a family. Dad sat at one end of the table, I sat at the other. Granddad over on one side by himself, and my mother and Aunt Al shared the other side. I kept still. If the conversation was going to start, Granddad started it. And this one night, during the day, he had taken a finished violin down to Laffy for evaluation, and out of curiosity, or just on a whim, he took the violin with him that he had finished. It was built, but he didn't have one drop of stain or varnish on it. He took him down, and Laffy asked him to leave both with him. He was puzzled by that, but he did. And he related that incident when he got home at the supper table. And he went on to say, he told about what went on, and I wrote this up as a story that I titled The White Violin. And I'll beg your indulgence while I read it. This is story number 7 of my first book, the book entitled The Grandpa Stories. This is a very rough copy of that book. It's a photocopier copy because I didn't have enough copies printed. There is one here of the original form and one in the library. But this is the story of the white violin. I have no idea when Gramps made his first violin. He was already making extremely fine instruments from my earliest recollection. Actually, he never claimed that he made violins. They were just plain fiddles. Anyone, including Stradivarius himself, was a fiddle maker as far as he was concerned. It did not take the Great Depression long to bottom out Gramps' construction business. By mid-1930, it was all but dead, and he had plenty of time to make fiddles and make new friendships with others who shared his interest on the subject. One of these newfound friends was Mr. Laffy, who instructed in stringed instruments for the Zobel Music Studios. The Zobel family was long established and admired in the Ripon community. Edgar Zobel was also accomplished across the full range of brass instruments, and his sister Lillian was a splendid pianist. So I can She taught piano and accompanied Edgar whenever he gave a recital or public performance. Edgar and Lillian, along with Mr. Laffey and Mr. Bronson, who instructed in the woodwinds, made up the studio staff. There was a long-standing good friendship between the Zobel and Farvour families, so between this and the mutual interest in violins, Gramps and Mr. Laffey became close friends almost immediately upon Laffey's arrival in Ripon. Gramps had 4 violins in various stages of construction. One is finished and ready for stringing. The next 2 were finished as far as building was concerned, but not completely stained and varnished. The 4th was built, but not finished yet. And the finishing had yet to be commenced. One day Gramps took the finished one to Laffey for an examination, and as an afterthought took the unfinished with him too. When he came home that evening, he had a puzzled look on his face. He told us that Laffey had asked him to leave both violins, and he had done so. He told about his visit with Edgar and Laffey and their concerns for the competition they were getting from the now growing Ripon College School of Music. Edgar's bucking to college, he said, with his usual snort. He's got his hands full too, and I just don't know how it's going to come out. A few years later, he announced, Edgar's given a recital at the Methodist Church Friday night and asked me to come. Laffey's going to play one of my fiddles. I haven't been in that church since I helped to build it 30 years ago. I guess I ought to go and take it in. You want to come? He said, looking at me. I lit up like the proverbial Christmas tree. You bet, Gramps, I almost yelled. I got a stern look from Mom and Dad, no reprimand. Friday was 2 days away. It seemed like 2 months. Friday came, supper was eaten, and away we went. The night was bitter cold, but my heart was warm as Gramps and I trudged down the street to the recital. On the arrival at the church, we seemed to be treated like visiting royalty. Our coats were whisked away and hung up for us. Gramps headed for a pew near the back, but it did no avail. We were ushered down to the very front row next to the center aisle. Gramps didn't like that at all, but he offered no visible objections. I felt very ill at ease. After all, when people looked at Gramps, they were going to be seeing me too, and I'd never been in a spot like that before. The hall soon filled and the program started on schedule. Edgar did his own announcing and played brilliantly. Lillian was at her best on the piano. It was indeed a splendid program. Then Edgar introduced Mr. Laffey and said he would announce his own selections. Shortly before this, an article had appeared in the Milwaukee Journal telling of a new theory explaining the unmatchable excellence of the tone of Stradivarius violins. This revolved around the ingredients and the stains and varnishes that used in the violin finishes. Mr. Laffey discussed this at some length. I guess I didn't find it particularly interesting and let my attention stray. As I amused myself gazing about, I was startled to see the unfinished violin stringed and ready to play on top of the piano. I just couldn't contain myself. Excitedly, I poked Gramps and striving to keep from talking out loud, said, Gramps, look, on the piano. Gramps hadn't noticed it either and was equally taken aback by what he saw. Laffey continued his lecture with, well, folks, you may not know it, but you have a master violin maker right here among you. This is Mr. Frank Farvour, and he's here with us tonight. Mr. Farvour, would you stand, please? Gramps was obviously flustered. A glory seeker he was not, but he did stand to face the audience and nod to them. He was visibly relieved to sit down. Laffey continued, I told you about all that nonsense about the varnish on the violin giving it its tone. Now here's a violin made by Mr. Farvour that has no finish on it at all. I'll play it for you and let you decide for yourselves. And he did. He must have been at his all-time best, for he wrung some almost unbelievable sounds from the instrument. I am sure he had made his point. The crowd just did not want to let him stop, but finally did. Laffey was radiant when the audience rose in a standing ovation. He beamed and came down from the platform to stand with Gramps and me. I didn't just know what to do. I grinned grabbed Gramps' hand and squeezed. He squeezed mine in return. It was a great moment for both of us. That's the relationship we had. That story pretty well demonstrates the relationship we had. The rest of them in the Grandpa Stories books will give detail to our adventures, such as hiking to South Woods, going to the circus, visiting the railroad yards, the clothing store for a new hat, and the meat market for a pint of oysters. It seemed that Gramps knew everything. When I asked him what a rainbow was, he produced a prism and projected the spectrum on the back of his ever-present pouch of plowboy chewing tobacco. He was crusty but gentle. He loved animals, but strangely, anything but dogs. He'd been an ardent hunter in his younger days, but by the time I came along, he no longer had either a rifle or a shotgun. I was not raised in a hunting household and never became one myself. He had the patience of a saint and the unlimited tolerance for the likes of a kid such as I. The life as a carpenter contractor was neither an easy nor one without its hazard. He told of falling from the scaffolding on 2 occasions. The first one, he broke 3 ribs that never did heal properly and said they bulged inward and put continuing pressure on his heart. The second time, he made up his mind that he was going to land on his feet. He managed to turn in the air and as he fell, and his feet struck a sawhorse squarely in the middle. It broke the 2x6 clean in two, as he put it. But between his excellent condition and the breaking of the sawhorse, absorbing part of the energy, he simply climbed up the ladder and went back to work. Gramps had little use for doctors. He had a copy of the 1889 issue of the Family Medical Advisor and figured he knew as much as they did. He had a very involved formula whereby he believed he could determine how old he might hope to live. It told him that he would never see 77. In the early fall of 1940, his health started to fail, and he had to go to the hospital. It was determined to be congestive heart failure, aggravated by the ribs pressing on his heart. His last hours were spent reliving the days as superintendent of the hospital construction. He died peacefully in his sleep. His last crew was made up of Alfred, or Pacer, Zick, August Bielo, and Walter Krieger. Pacer was the only one to outlive Gramps and was present at his funeral. As the casket was placed on the hoist for the lowering it of the wall, the strap supporting it at the head end slipped and it fell nearly a foot. It was Pacer who darted up and supported it until it could be stabilized. His crew were really loyal to the end. And that's what I have to say.